How do we work to be anti-racist as communities? And less emphasis on, well, how do we root out the racist individuals among us?
You're listening to Good Faith Weekly. I'm Mitch Randall.
And I'm Missy Randall.
We're here each week exploring the intersection of faith and culture
We find people who stand up, speak out, and step forward.
for inclusion, freedom, and justice for all.
It's time for Good Faith Weekly.
Brought to you by Good Faith Media. Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Missy and I are going to catch up, and I'm going to tell you why I was in Boston, Massachusetts over the weekend. And then later on in the pod, Missy and I sat down with Reverend Angela Denker, who's got a new book out titled Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. Before we begin the pod, though, we do want to extend our deepest sympathies to all of our friends in the Roman Catholic Church at the passing of Pope Francis. We just want to take a moment to reflect upon his life and ministry and what he taught us as the Pope. He was a man of inclusion and justice, and everybody can appreciate his ministry. So let's just take a moment to remember Pope Francis. Hello there, Missy.
Hey, how are you?
I'm well, and you?
Well, I was feeling pretty dadgum good about myself until just a couple of hours ago.
Okay, do tell.
So, and I will attempt to keep this short because I know that what you want to talk about in this opening segment,
I'm pretty stoked. I'm not
you're
going to
pretty
lie.
excited about it. Yes, I will, but it ties in to a certain degree. So yes, this weekend you traveled out of town, getting to do something super cool, which you'll talk about in a minute. I was left by myself at home, and we were expecting basically a monsoon of rain.
Yes.
So I was faced with having to basically deal with a place in our yard that was dirt and mud, getting prepared for, landscaping or whatever, which was going to be done whenever you got home. But, with 9 inches of rain on the way, I had to do something because this was just dirt up next to the house.
Yeah.
So
I was so comforted knowing that you were back here taking care of the land.
I'm sure you were. And I'm pretty sure we've probably talked about this before. But, I am not one for physical manual labor. This may come as a surprise to some of you.
Why do I feel like there's a drop coming from our media producers?
This is not my
Go ahead.
wheelhouse and my forte, nor is any sort of land work.
You could have just said work and we would have been okay.
Okay, and we're good. So anyways, I'm panicking because, we've had problems with moisture under the house before. I've got to get something done. So I thought, okay, I'm just going to go to Lowe's. I'm going to get some of the landscaping rock or whatever that we were planning to put by that part of the house. So on that Friday, while you were nowhere to be found, 3 trips to Lowe's and all of this landscaping rock stepping stones later. One, it looks beautiful.
It does. It looks great. You did a good job.
But here's the thing. I hauled by myself, I calculated it out, over 1,200 pounds of landscaping rock and stepping stones. That many bags that I put in my cart at Lowe's, took to my car, lifted into my car, brought them home, took them out of my car, had to walk up steps, down steps, and then dump them on the ground before even opening the bags and spreading them out, right?
Wow.
So I was feeling...
That's impressive.
I was feeling pretty good about myself, pretty accomplished,
Yes.
okay? Until today. So I look out the window this morning and I noticed our neighbor across the street, who is 90-something years old. Is out working in her garden.
Yes.
And I was like, well, shoot. Then, I thought, okay, she's pruning the flowers or whatever. That's fine. Well, then about lunchtime, you come out and go to the front window and you say, how old is Gladys? Side note, that's not her real name, you guys. Anyway, you said, how old is Gladys? And I was like, oh, she's 92. And I said, why? And you said, she is outside with a sledgehammer.
She was. I mean, we do live by a railroad. Thank God she was not working on the railroad.
No. So I'm not sure what exactly she was doing, but she was out there with a sledgehammer working in her yard at 92 years old.
Yeah.
So I was feeling pretty good about myself until I saw sweet Miss Gladys over there.
Well, I mean, you've got
Working in
about
her yard.
40 years to go, and you too can start swinging a sledge.
Here's the thing. There's no part of me that's going to carry a sledgehammer and do yard work, whatever she was trying to knock down at 92 years old.
That's
So
hysterical.
that is my story for the day.
Well, I
Just
do-
burst my bubble.
That's what I appreciate about you, is that you're out back home working the land.
I was working. So, anyways, tell us about what you were able to do last
Oh, my
weekend, because I know you're so
goodness.
excited.
I'm so excited. I scored a pass to an incredible event in Boston, Massachusetts last Friday, which was April 18th, 2025. Does that date ring a bell?
Well, ordinarily, no.
It was, Missy, the 250th anniversary of Paul Revere's ride through New England, warning the colonists that the British were coming. But not only that, it's also the 250th anniversary of what sparked that ride, and that is in the Old North Church in the north end of Boston, where two gentlemen climbed up to the belfry and put either one or two lanterns into the window to warn everybody across the land that the British were coming. And once they did that, putting two lanterns in the belfry, then everybody knew that the British were on the move. And Paul Revere and others began to ride through the villages, warning everybody, the British are coming, the British are coming.
Right. So we found out about that weekend, it being the 250th anniversary, and thought, oh, that would be fun to go. But it wasn't until you learned, or we learned, who was going to be speaking at the Old North Church that you got really excited. I got
excited.
Incredibly jealous.
There's so many people who are jealous because of this.
But
So we were celebrating, it was called the Lighting of the Lantern service. And the featured speaker that night, drum roll please. Very good. Heather Cox Richardson was the speaker that night.
If you do not know who Heather Cox Richardson is, you need to go on all of your socials and follow her or sign up for her newsletter. She has become just a household name of historians among us. She is brilliant. She posts and writes letters from an American about historical events, and she's just brilliant in the way she ties things together. You and I have become super fans in the last several years. And so, yes, you being able to hear her speak was just really, really cool.
Yeah. And I mean, there were so many great speakers. The mayor of Boston, Michelle Wu, was there. And then there were other dignitaries there who spoke eloquently, but everybody was there for the address by Heather Cox Richardson. Now, I do have to say, I did get a little giddy as I was standing in the back, recording everything and taking photos and getting and pulling quotes, when all of a sudden I looked to my right and guess who was standing beside me?
Who's that?
James Taylor.
Wow.
If Stephen King would have walked in, I would have just fallen over dead.
That's
It was really cool.
So talk to us about, I know you kind of learned some little nuggets. And for those of us who it's been a minute since we've been in an American history class talking about those times, tell us what were some of the little fun facts.
Well, what's really great about being in cities like Boston is that history really, truly does come alive when you get to learn from people like the caliber of Heather Cox Richardson. And so, she's giving her lecture or her presentation that night. And, she's pointing out that, this English general worshiped here because it was an Anglican church. In fact, he worshiped right over there in that pew, which was a box pew. And she was talking about when the lanterns were lit and that the two gentlemen had to descend from the belfry. They escaped through this window because the British were actually coming. But what was really, really amazing about her presentation is, one, she set the stage. 1775, this is April. The Revolutionary War begins in 1776. Just almost a year later, the Declaration of Independence is written and passed, and then the war actually began that night, April 18th, 1775. And so she sets the tone. She reminds the audience that it was in 1770 when the Boston Massacre occurred. British soldiers fired upon men and boys who were giving the soldiers business. Rifle went off and several were killed, others were wounded. And then 3 years later, the Boston Tea Party took place, planned by the Sons of Liberty at one of my favorite restaurants in Boston,
The Green Dragon.
the Green Dragon. That's exactly right. And so all of this was building the tension in the Massachusetts Bay Colonies.
Okay, I want you to tell us there were some interesting facts that you brought up, talking about just the makeup of the city of Boston and who resided there at the time.
Yeah, so I mean, tensions were high, and so you had the Sons of Liberty making, all of these plans and denouncing what the crown was doing over in England. Well, they were doing it at their peril because what Heather Cox Richardson told the crowd was that there were 7,000 residents of Boston who lived there, but they lived among 13,000 British soldiers and their family and friends. So this wasn't a majority of people who lived in the Boston area. So you had 7,000 Bostonians who lived there, and then you had 13,000 who were associated with the British Army and with the Crown in general.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, they were really at risk when they were, making these claims, planning the Boston Tea Party, and then the moment, the crescendo is that April 18th, 1775 evening. So all the plans were laid. The uprising had taken place, and the king had decided it was time to perform some law and order in Boston and the surrounding towns. So the British are mobilizing at this point, and they are moving out of Boston on their way to Lexington and Concord.
Mhm.
And it's at that moment that the plan goes into full swing. And Paul Revere and his colleagues, who were Captain John Pulling and the church's sexton, Robert Newman, as well as Captain Thomas Bernard, ran to the church. They were in charge of the church, and they had the keys, and they opened up the church. Or this preconceived plan was to go up to the belfry and either put one lantern in the window or two lanterns in the window. Do you remember
And
1 and 2?
oh yes, unfortunately for his colleagues, their names didn't rhyme with anything,
They
so
did not.
that's why they're unfamiliar to us.
Very true.
So yes, one if by land, two if by sea.
That's exactly right.
Yes.
So they put two because the British had gotten on boats on the Charles, which it is now called, and began to sail up towards Lexington and Concord. So they put two lanterns in the window. Now, here is a very interesting point of the story.
Mhm.
The belfry in the church, Boston obviously was not Boston back then. You could see the steeple tower for miles upon miles. And for anybody who's been in Boston, you could see it from Charlestown across the river.
That's so crazy.
So crazy. So they knew once they put those lanterns in the window that it was going to be a warning. The Sons of Liberty knew what it meant.
Mhm.
A lot of the citizens knew what it meant. But guess who also knew what it meant?
The British?
The British.
So that was confusing to me when you talked about it.
Yes. So the British knew as well. Again, you're talking about 20,000 people in this township. And so rumors were swirling
And
about
13,000 of them are
British.
British
or
soldiers and families.
Yeah, loyal to the crown, let's say.
Okay.
And so, yeah, they knew that they only had minutes to get this done, to sound out the warning.
Mhm.
And so they go up to the bell tower. They put the lanterns in. Guess how long those lanterns were in that window?
I don't know.
60 seconds.
Okay. I didn't know that, and I guess I've just never thought about it.
Yeah, because they knew once those lanterns went into the window, the British would come, because they knew that they were being warned. They were warning all the other colonists of the movement, the troop movements. So they knew British forces were going to come to the church. This was an Anglican church, by the way, that was still run by the crown.
Okay.
And so they knew they were committing treason and they were
Who's
going to be
they?
arrested. That would have been, Missy, thank you for asking, Robert Newman, Captain John Pulling, and Captain Thomas Bernard.
Who sadly don't rhyme with anything.
They do not.
Okay, gotcha.
So that is indeed what happens. Well, the message has already been out, and so that leads Paul Revere and some others to begin riding the famous ride.
Mm.
And so Revere goes to, he actually gets in a boat, navigates his way across the river. Again, the British soldiers are in boats. So he's got to navigate his way through the British soldiers to get to the other side where Charlestown is. And then that's where he begins his ride from Charlestown all the way over to Concord and Lexington. I mean, it is really, really a remarkable story. And it just really is fascinating. But there is this incredible quote that I want to mention by Heather Cox Richardson. So this is Heather Cox Richardson reminding us about the significance of these 60 seconds. The professor said this: they, Newman and Pulling, agreed to cross through town and to light 2 lanterns in a church steeple. It sounds like such a little thing to do, and yet by doing it, they risked imprisonment or even death. It was such a little thing, but it was everything.
Wow.
And you think about, these guys weren't thinking they were going to change the world. They
Right.
were just trying to fight for freedom, protect their way of life, protect their families. And they light these 2 lamps in this church steeple and change the course of history forever. As Richardson said, such a little thing, but it changed everything.
That's amazing. I know you and I have kind of talked a lot since you've been back home about, her speech
Mhm.
and others, and kind of little tidbits about that moment, and just how great of a job she did and you've done communicating. These are just average. I mean, these are just guys. I mean, and like you
Yeah.
said, they're living in Boston and they're not the majority. I
No.
think that's kind of what we've been taught or led to believe growing up, is that all of Boston, or all of the colonies, are rallying together, and that was not necessarily
Not the case at all.
They were the minority. She said Boston had more folks who were bucking back against the king,
Mhm.
but they still were not the majority.
No.
And so they just thought, well, we're just going to do this thing and see if it sticks.
Right.
See if it works.
Yep.
And so I mean, I think you can draw some parallels to our time today. I don't know.
Yeah. And here is the message that the professor left the audience that was in awe of her storytelling ability. But she ends with this: most of us will be lost to history, but we will nonetheless move the story forward, even just a little bit. And once in a great while, someone will light a lantern, or even 2, and they will shine forth for democratic principles that are under siege and set the world ablaze.
Wow. She's just amazing.
She was so amazing. But I mean, she was one of many speakers. And, as I write in my column this week, I'm just really starting to sense the urgency in everybody's voice. Obviously, I was in Boston and was able to connect what happened 250 years ago with what is going on today. But we're continuing to hear from people, Missy, on this podcast, from writers at goodfaithmedia.org, from a lot of other folks in our sphere. And it seems as though in the last 30 to 60 days,
Mm-hmm.
those voices are speaking with much more urgency.
Mm-hmm.
And I also don't want to lose this: the significance that this warning that changed the world was, the message was given to us in the steeple of a church.
Wow.
And I think about all the voices. Heather Cox Richardson, rising to the pulpit there at Old North Church. I think of interviews that we've had in the past with Matthew Dowd, with Robert P. Jones, with so many others, and today's interview with Angela Denker. I mean, these are theologians, these are people of faith who are sounding the alarm that tyranny is once again at our shores and calling us to action.
Mm-hmm.
We need to continue to look towards that steeple and heed those warnings. Now, I also recognize that there's a lot of darkness in a lot of the steeples across this country who are espousing an entirely different message, who are loyal to the king, so to speak. We must listen for the voices who are warning us, because the time is now and the moment is strong close. And we are called to stand up, speak out, and step forward at this moment and this time. The voices that matter are calling us to action. And so we have been given a warning and given
2 lamps.
2 lamps. I love that. And so let's get to it. I mean, it is time.
Well, thank you for the recap and also the motivation to do something, because as I've said a number of times, I don't think hiding under the covers is super effective, even though that's my default. But there are many people out there today who are continuing to light those lamps in the steeples, who are continuing to ride the rides and sound the warnings of things that are going on in our culture and in our country. And one of those is Angela Denker.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. We got to sit down with Angela Denker, as you said. She's got a new book out titled Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. It is a really fascinating conversation about what's going on across America with our boys, or attempt of radicalization of them. And it is a great conversation. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with Angela Denker.
For decades, the Festival of Homiletics has nurtured, challenged, and inspired thousands of preachers in their God-given calling. And this May, you can be part of the revival from the comfort of your own home. Live stream the sermons and lectures from our compelling speakers throughout the week, or watch the recordings at your leisure, and participate in dynamic community through our interactive platform. Please join us as we restore what has been depleted and nourish one another at the festival. Please visit www.festivalofhomiletics.com to reserve your spot today.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we got a very special guest with us. Reverend Angela Denker is an award-winning author, ELCA Lutheran pastor, and veteran journalist. Her first book, Red State Christians, was a 2019 Silver Foreword Indies Award winner, and her second book, Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood, is currently available. Angela, welcome back to Good Faith Weekly.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be back.
Well, Angela, we are so delighted that you have joined us. Congratulations on the book. We're going to get to the book here in just a second. It is brilliantly written and really resonates with the two of us because we too have sons of our own. So, but before we get to the book, Angela, I do want to ask about the breaking news that came out this week. Pope Francis died at age 88. Francis was a revolutionary pope in the modern era, an advocate for the poor and more inclusive theology for the LGBTQ plus community, as well as the possibility of entertaining female leadership within the Catholic Church. So what was your reaction when you heard of Francis's death this week? And also talk a little bit about the legacy that you think he's going to leave behind.
Yeah, Easter morning, you're thinking that, okay,
Right.
we're done with Holy Week and can take a little breath. And I woke up to a text from my editor at the Minneapolis paper saying, Pope Francis has died. Can you have a piece for us soon? And they had kind of told me earlier that they would want something like that.
Mhm.
So immediately I started thinking about just the depth of his legacy. And for me personally, I come from what we call in Minnesota a very mixed marriage, which is a Lutheran mother and a Catholic father.
Wow.
So I grew up, shaped by this Midwestern Catholicism. And also for my dad's family, they were really, Pope Francis Catholics in many ways.
Mhm.
They are champions of social justice. My cousins have worked in low-income Catholic schools. They've worked for Habitat for Humanity. And I have seen, even from my father, who was raised in the Catholic Church, again, not saying that his experience with the nuns and
Right.
Catholic school and all those things were perfect, coming from a big family, 7 kids. But he really did have this sense of openness and this sense of honoring a church that could be bigger than what so many narrow fundamentalist conservative Catholics have wanted it to be. So that was really meaningful for me And I think as Lutherans, it's always interesting because we have this history of a founder, Martin Luther, who began as a Catholic monk, and he had this dream to reform the one holy apostolic church. And so there's this weird coexistence with Catholicism in the Lutheran Church, and specifically in the ELCA. I think in the Missouri Synod, there's still a lot more antipathy towards the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
But in the ELCA, there is this desire for unity and this desire, and I think Francis shared that in many ways. And so you see that in the grief that many of us feel and the trepidation about how the conservative Catholics, on whom I've reported for many, many years now, and was very aware, they never fully saw him as their pope. They very much wanted to hang on to Benedict. There's worry about how are they going to try to snatch the church back to a much more narrow fundamentalist position in the world.
Yeah. Well, appreciate that. And check out Angela's article. It's in the Minnesota Tribune, right?
Yes.
Minneapolis Tribune.
Yeah, we actually switched it to Minnesota Star Tribune, but a lot of people still call it the Minneapolis paper. So either one.
That was my confusion. I'm going to go with that.
Either one's totally fine. But if you jump on my social media, I have put gift links on there for people. So if you're not a subscriber, you can check out the gift link there, or you can get it on my Substack too.
Great.
Well, Angela, let's switch and talk about the book a little bit. It is brilliantly written. You are obviously pastor, theologian, journalist, and a scholar. But I want to start off by talking about just your personal connection to the book. Like we mentioned, you're raising two boys. Mitch and I have raised two boys as well. So just the parts where you kind of wove in your narrative as a mom really resonated with me, from, snuggling them as tiny babies and trying to nurture and care for them and knowing what the world was going to throw at them as far as expectations of, toughening up and all of these things. And so I want to know, just talk to us a little bit about how the personal, inspired you, to complete this work.
Yeah, and this was not the book that I initially intended to write next.
Right.
And the publisher came to me with this idea. And initially I was a little bit hesitant. I, thought that it might be a little bit too negative, honestly, in some ways. I was kind of hoping to turn away from the Christian nationalism focused work I had done in Red State Christians. But it really was my conversations, not only with other journalists and other pastors, but also with other moms and grandmas and grandparents in general and dads, that led me to feel like, no, I really need to write this book. Because everybody I talked to when I said I'm thinking about writing about boys and men and radicalization and Christianity, almost everybody had a story of somebody they loved, somebody who had been impacted by radicalization, someone who in their lives was struggling with identity, with their own understanding of masculinity. And I really saw that because there's been kind of this hesitancy to talk about masculinity in mainstream, moderate, progressive spaces, that we've created this vacuum of content, and all that's rushing in to fill it are these manosphere guys who are looking to make money off of people's search for identity. So it was my goal to have something else to offer. And also it is deep, but I also think that moms are powerful. We've seen that in recent years. And unfortunately, some of that power and influence has really been weaponized by the right in groups like Moms for Liberty and movements like the anti-vax movement. So I think I wanted to channel some of that power and influence of moms and parents and put it towards a healthier, kinder vision of masculinity for all of the boys who we love.
Did you end up talking to your boys about this? Because we're constantly in conversation with our boys, and we hear stories within their context that kind of makes us raises our eyebrows of what they're experiencing out there. Did some of your research included talking to your boys about what you were writing about and researching?
Yeah, definitely. And I do think that is the number one way, by the way, to defend against radicalization are conversations with our kids. So just the fact, it's not even about what you say or having the right words, but just the fact that we're having conversations, I always tell parents that is the most important thing. So certainly we are doing that. And I find myself too, as my kids get older, um, you're walking this delicate line. And so I wanted to put the personal into the book, but also it's so important for us to protect our kids from being exposed or exploited on social media or in public. So I'm careful about how much I share personally about the kids, but I will say, during COVID, my oldest son, he was around 8, 9 years old at that time. And I remember the name Andrew Tate becoming like a punchline among him and his friends, which was a pattern that I would hear over and over again, even from older boys and young men, that a lot of times these figures who are pushing radicalization come into people's lives as a joke and they think it's funny. And then inevitably, when somebody's alone and they're watching content on their own, the algorithm doesn't know that they've been watching it as a joke. And so it ends up popping up again. And when somebody's in a vulnerable spot, all of a sudden that becomes a point of influence and reference and belonging for them. So that was something I did see personally.
Yeah.
And then I also just think it's over and over again, hey, what you watching on YouTube? What's this?
Yeah.
What's this thing that's popping up? How are you talking about girls? How are you understanding yourself as a boy? And I do notice too, my youngest son is 9 right now, and 9 is this age when they must get this rush of testosterone. I don't know if you've had this experience with your boys, but it's like there's so much competition between the friend groups. And even today as we're recording, my son's getting ready for this race at school, and it's been this major point of contention for weeks. And there's just this jostling for position. And so I really feel like we're going through it with him. That's a reality. Testosterone's a reality. Masculinity as competition, as fight, is a reality. And even for boys like mine who do kind of tend to some of those more traditional boy pursuits like sports or like trying to jockey for being the strongest and the best, I balance that with also seeing the immense sensitivity that they hold and the need that they have to be vulnerable too, and that for that to be okay.
Let's shift gears to bad theology, Angela, because you talk a lot about it in the book. There's a lot of people who recently have woken up to this toxic masculinity as it becomes part of their life, or they encounter it, in their neighborhoods or churches or schools. But this has been a growing trend for quite some time. I mean, in the book, you talk about white Jesus. You talk about the militarization of boyhood, the submission of women, complementarianism. I mean, the list goes on. So, how has bad theology led to this point that we are today?
Yeah, as a journalist, I think what has happened is that these ideas like complementarianism, submission of women, very strictly defined gender roles, they have always existed in American culture. But journalists have been hesitant to cover their influence on culture, on politics, on commerce, because they feel like, well, this is religious beliefs. And so what has happened is these beliefs about how women should always submit to men, about how men and husbands should always have the final say in a decision in marriage, that women should not serve in leadership roles in churches, they are now hugely influential on culture in general. So what I always want to emphasize for people is that even if you are a family that doesn't go to church, if you're a family that does not have these ideas from conservative Christianity, from fundamentalist religion as part of your own family's belief system, your kids are getting fed this message system through social media, through influencers who are pushing, trad wife ideas. There is big money, big business pushing these ideas that, yes, do come out of a fundamentalist framework, but they're not inherently, I would say, Christian ideas. These are much more ideas that are common to all fundamentalist religious groups and have very little to do with Jesus. So I think it's important to call out those differences, and
Mhm.
also just to note how strong these ideas are rooted in American culture, in pop culture, in music, uh, in so many different places. We have to continue to excavate the way that ideas are influencing our young people.
And how, because you spend the first part of the book talking or recapture or retelling the story of Dylan Roof and
Mm.
just the terrible events that took place at Mother Emanuel in Charleston. How has white supremacy fueled the militarization of faith to get to the point where we get Dylan Roofs? I mean, here in Norman, Oklahoma, where Missy and I live, we just commemorated the 30th anniversary of Timothy McVeigh, who, you know, could be seen as the precursor to what we're experiencing today in a very real sense. How has white supremacy led? Because when you refer to Jesus in the context of toxic masculinity, you called Jesus white Jesus, or identify the white Jesus. So talk a little bit about that if you could.
Yeah, I was surprised when I would tell people what I was writing about, that so many people, even people who weren't affiliated with the church or people of faith, they would say, "Oh, are you going to talk about white Jesus?" And it became aware to me. Uh, I think we also saw, in TV shows, people talking about white Jesus, reservation dogs. I think they had a whole piece on
Oh
white
yeah,
Jesus
it
at
was a
one
great
point.
episode.
Yes, yes. So I wanted to capture that sense of really making a distinction between the Jesus of the Bible,
Mhm.
the Jesus of faith, and this cultural American construct of white Jesus that really is not exclusively American. It's a global phenomenon of painting Jesus as some sort of military strongman. And certainly the fact that his skin is white, his hair is blonde, his eyes are often blue is a critical part of that construct. That in order for him to be strong and powerful and mighty and in control, he has to be white.
Mhm.
Because this entire faith system and system of beliefs rests upon hierarchy. And in this particular fundamentalist structure, the top of that hierarchy are white men, and specifically white men with money. So the imagery is important. The names are important, and the hierarchy is what must be defended at all costs.
So I want to talk to you about that hierarchy because
Yeah.
you allude to it in some of the stories that you tell of white supremacists who have adopted this, and then even I'm going to talk about examples later on in our conversation about examples of people finding their way out or young men finding their way out of this. But you talk about Calvinism and how influential hyper Calvinism is to this movement. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, this came out of, and we have sort of a couple of distinct strains of this, but really in the 2010s, when you have guys like Mark Driscoll, John Piper,
Mhm.
trying to make Calvinism cool again. And they're,
Is
They
that on
missed.
your bumper
I was
sticker?
going to
I need
say
to know.
they missed out on an incredible marketing opportunity.
and it's so pathetic because these guys who are pushing it are
Yeah,
just the very opposite of cool,
exactly.
right?
Right.
But
Exactly.
they have a very thin veil of, they know they're not cool, so they're trying to compensate for it with
Mhm.
this hyper sense of masculinity. But I think Calvinism, I think John Calvin would roll over in his
Oh,
grave if
no
he
doubt.
knew that Mark Driscoll was using his theological framework in order to support guns and cowboy hats and men having the right to sex with their wives at any time, regardless of whether their wives were interested in that or not. That's not what John Calvin wrote his theology for.
Right.
Uh, but the thing about Calvinism is it is very systematized, unlike Lutheran theology, which is a series of paradoxes and stories. Calvinism is very systematized. And so you have folks like even, outliers like Jordan Peterson, who comes to this from a philosophical perspective. They want to use complex words and ideas to confuse people and to
Mhm.
make people think, wow, we're really buying into this heady intellectual idea. And it's just repackaging the old ideas of white supremacy into new and shiny packages. And they really pair it with Greek philosophy. They pair it with, again, these old ideas, but at the center, the connective thread to all of it is subjugation of women and is white supremacy.
Mm.
And it's all kind of, that's why they say, well, we're learning from Western writers. We're going back to traditional ideas. I'm thinking about classical education, something championed by Doug Wilson, who comes up again and again in the book, and also has overlap again with conservative Catholics who are also championing classical Catholic schools in favor of traditional parochial schools. So all of it goes together, and all of it is tied together, though, again, by these two central themes of subjugation of women and white supremacy.
But you talk about, I'm sorry, I want to go back for a second. I have a note here. There's a part where you talk about boys growing up today in this 24-hour news cycle with an ever-evolving understanding of gender and sexuality, with racial tension, and then of course a pandemic. That this type of certainty that's being sold is so compelling. I just thought that was a really great point. And when you mentioned about Calvinism and that is kind of that certainty that's required, just that why that's so attractive, and it just makes sense on a broader scale of how kind of this problem is continuing to get worse.
Mm.
And it's so all-encompassing. Once you buy into this worldview, you're required to kind of sign on to everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's all, you have to just continue rubber stamping anything that comes across. Even these outlandish, I've been saying now for almost a decade that the sole sort of saving grace or black gift of Donald Trump is that he is bringing this stuff out into the open.
Mm-hmm.
That, these ideas and people that have said, well, our motivations are morality, our motivations are Christianity, he's just making it really impossible for that to be true.
Right.
It's just nakedly in pursuit of power and wealth. And you can see that really in the churches, in mega churches in particular, in large evangelical churches, in prominent evangelical pastors. They're not hiding it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's about wealth. It's about power. It's about association with those in power. And so I do think that what happens then for ordinary people, in all of our lives who we love and care about, especially boys and young men, when they start to sign on, it's such an all-encompassing movement that in order to step away and break out, you are stepping out of an entire ecosystem. You're stepping out of a place where all your relationships and all of your associations are held together by this ideology. It's the music you listen to. It's the movies you go to. It's the schools your kids attend. And so that's why I always tell people it's really important to find ways to maintain some kind of sort of relationship and contact with people in your life who have gone deep into mega Christianity. Because when people do want to get out or turn around, it's a big choice because the movement is so all encompassing.
You're so right about. It goes back to what we're talking about with the bad theology. It seems like all of this has culminated to where we are today, and as you so articulated in your comments, that now this is being played out. Everything you just mentioned. We're talking about white supremacy. We're talking about Calvinism. We're talking about the patriarchy. We're talking about the prosperity gospel. It seems all of these, bad theological convictions that people in the church have held for quite some time are now actually being played out in the public square, and that bad theology is now becoming a political tool to be placed upon all of us, or an attempt is being placed on all of us. So that's just terrifying to me. But I'm glad that there are people like you, Angela, that are out there calling attention to it and helping us counter it. So this leads me to some of the more positive points of the book, because you do tell some really good stories. One is of a pastor, Caleb Campbell, in Desert Springs, Arizona, who found himself wrapped up inside of this world, but then discovered a way out. So what advice would you have for parents of young boys, young men themselves who find themselves wrapped up in this white supremacist Christian nationalism movement, of finding a way out or being observant of what's going on?
I think one of the main, consistent messages that I have for folks, no matter what we're encountering as parents or at people as educators or as faith leaders, it's to really guard against the use of shame as a technique. And shame, of course, has been a hallmark of Christian parenting. It's, what I think, many Christian parenting educators have emphasized shame as a tool. They've certainly used shame as a tool when it comes to counseling and having conversations with people who are gay. And it is just such a pernicious weapon, because what shame does in many people is that it then manifests itself out as hatred and violence towards others. And so the advice that I have instead is, to just allow people to be who God has created them to be, to have a flexible sense of identity with your kids. I mean, I think back to all the different sorts of identities that I tried on as a teenager and as a young adult, and the ways that my own sense of my identity has changed over the years. I'm already starting to see that with my boys. And, sometimes kids are going to say outlandish things, or they're going to say things that are maybe prejudiced. They're going to say things that are hateful.
Mhm.
And as a parent, I think, and as faith leaders and coaches and educators, our job is to help kids work their way through those things. Because I think, I see this even we live in a pretty progressive neighborhood here in Minneapolis, but I see it in our schools, and I see it in a lot of political conversations on the left, that we've been so attuned to policing, racist words or what people say, or, just the most egregious public actions. And we've really paid under attention to the ways that racism is part of our structures. It's part of our institutions. It's part of the ways that wealth is handed down. And so I think we need to put more emphasis into how do we work to be anti-racist as communities, and less emphasis on, well, how do we root out the racist individuals among us? Because the reality is, for me as a white European American, racism has been a part of the air that I have breathed.
Mhm.
And so I think it's important to acknowledge the ways that it is. And that's why I did start with Dylan Roof too,
Right.
because he comes from the same denomination that I do. He doesn't come from an ultra conservative right-wing background. He comes from an ELCA congregation. And so I think it's that classic Jesus line, take the log out of our own eyes before we remove the speck from others.
And another point along those lines is that this isn't going to happen overnight. This is a conversation that is going to be long term. You point that out in the story you tell about the minister talking to his youth group and the young men during confirmation, about after 2 years of doing Bible study and conversations with them, then all of a sudden it got real, and the minister was really surprised about the things that he was hearing from the boys. And so it takes time to do all of this, and that's why we have to stay engaged.
It does, and I think we also have to remember that those personal spiritual practices are an important part of this, personal prayer, personal discernment and seeking where God is leading. I think that, white American Christians have so often been in the halls of power that we have not had to look and understand as much. What does it mean to be a church that is actively resisting power? What does it mean to be a church that is actively divesting itself of power? And I think that those kind of active responses and willful giving up of power, we certainly saw that in Pope Francis in many ways personally. Those are going to be some of the things that begin to cause people to be curious and wonder about these prevailing, quote unquote, cultural Christian values that have led to a lot of moral rot, decay, depression, despair, addiction, broken relationships, difficulty in marriages. All of that has led to outcomes that are not great for our families.
Reverend Angela Denker, thank you so much for joining us on Good Faith Weekly. Her new book is Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. But Angela, before we let you go, we've got one last question, but before I punt it to Missy, I've got one other question. In your past life, you were you were a sports writer, sports journalist. In particular, you covered hockey. The Stanley Cup playoffs are starting. I know you live in Minnesota, and I know you're going to say the Wild. Who do you like in the Stanley Cup playoffs?
Oh my gosh, you're going to ask me this because I got to be honest, I have not watched an NHL game this year.
All right, we'll go with the Wild then. We'll go with the Minnesota Wild.
Let's go Wild. I've still got an old North Stars hat, so we're good.
Well, Angela, while you're busy working on, social, societal structures that need to be changed, we'll let Mitch follow the Stanley Cup. How's that?
That's right.
That's good. I mean, there's nothing better than hockey playoffs. I'm just busy watching, 18 youth basketball games a week.
That's a swath of time that you just truly do lose all connection to professional or even college sports. You're like, no, but I could tell you which club won the soccer tournament last weekend in Tulsa. Like, I've got that.
Exactly. I got all the stats and all the 12-year-old basketball players.
Super awesome. Relatable. Yes. Well, best of luck to your basketball players in their season. So we'll get to our last question now. Angela, as you know, our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." So in light of your work and our conversation today, what is your more to tell?
I'm just so grateful for Substack as a platform so I can continue to work through these ideas and issues week in and week out. And also, there's a little bit of a community there on my Substack. So we gather weekly for Sunday prayer over the lectionary Bible readings. I do twice a month news posts. And so that's been a really great place for me to continue to work out what's happening in the news, in the church, week to week, and with a community. So I'd love for folks to join me over there.
Excellent.
Well, make sure to check out her Substack. That will be in the show notes. And then after you subscribe to her Substack, go and buy her book, Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. It is on sale wherever you purchase your reading material. Angela, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us, and you are always welcome back to Good Faith Weekly.
Great to be with you guys. Thank you.
So, Mitch, I know we're running short on time, but I do want to talk a little bit more about the book in the fact that one thing Angela does in this book that I so appreciated was just telling the narrative, telling stories,
great stories
about actual people who have been involved in this radicalization process or their families. You mentioned in the beginning in one of your questions, Dylan Roof. Yeah. Of course, she talks a little bit about her own 2 children, which I super appreciate because I know that's difficult to do. Mm-hmm. She talks about another family who kind of descended into this world and several others. And so in addition to being kind of an informative educational book, she really does weave in that personal narrative that is just, it makes it so relatable and understandable. So I really appreciate that. And the other thing I was going to mention, we published a book a couple of years ago called True Colors, which was about specifically Baptist clergy's, road to full inclusion of LGBTQIA plus folks. But, one of the best quotes we've talked about before, we made a sticker out of it, was from Reverend Elizabeth Mott, who said, "Preaching Jesus radicalized me." And as I've been reading this book and as we went through the interview, that just keeps churning in my brain because obviously Angela is writing about a very different kind of radicalization. Yeah. That's kind of the tipping point. Are you being radicalized by Jesus as he was, or are you being radicalized by white Jesus? And so I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing to think about and always kind of measure yourself against. Like, who are you really emulating? Who are you really measuring yourself up against in your ethics, in your behavior? Is that white Jesus or is it actual Jesus?
Yeah, and the stories that you mentioned just a moment ago, and again, don't have time to go into some of those details, but those stories really do tell an important story of those 2 types of radicalizations, one that draws you into this toxic masculinity, but then the other that draws you into a relationship with Jesus and the ethic of Jesus and living out that ethic in the here and now. So that's a great book. It's, again, the title is Disciples of White Jesus, The Radicalization of American Boyhood. So after you click off this podcast, make certain you click on wherever you get your book and make sure you check it out. It's a great book.
Absolutely.
All right, Missy, we're at that time, and we got to make this quick. Time for hope and joy.
And I actually have multiple this week. I know that's shocking.
All right. Well, I may let you because I don't know if I have a lot of hope this week. So you go right ahead with your joys.
No, I'll go with my joy. One is what I mentioned in the beginning, just the sense of accomplishment of doing like land work by myself, which has never happened before. Land work. Me out here tilling.
A new Netflix series about Missy Randall. Land work.
Yes, yard work by myself. Again, never happened before, but it did give me a great sense of pride until I saw Gladys outside with her sledgehammer at 92 years old. But anyways, the other was just seeing you have such a great time and then reliving it, your time in Boston, just in such a historic moment. I know you love that place. And you love being in the middle of the historical, just scenes in the historical places. So I that brought me joy.
Yeah, and I guess I do have a hope, and that is my hope. And after the experience in Boston, I walked away with a renewed sense of inspiration, a new sense of hope in the world, that even in this day that seems so dark, people feel so alone, that all we need to do is every now and again glance up at the steeple tower, and hopefully there's some light to shine before us, put us on a hopeful future. So,
or warn us of impending doom.
Well, and that's Missy's hope for the week.
That's right.
So yeah, there's our joy and hope for the week. We'll be back next week, and until then, keep living good faith. You've been listening to Good Faith Weekly, hosted by Mitch and Missy Randall. This weekly podcast from Good Faith Media discusses matters of faith and culture.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcast and give us a like and a glowing review. We produce the podcast out of Norman, Oklahoma. Our music comes from Pond 5.
And we're supported by listeners like you. Learn more about us at goodfaithmedia.org.